Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Seriously, it's great to have you here, especially against the peering buff. So I'm just going to start, I guess they call this in TV a cold open. Please raise your hands and keep your hands up when I ask you. How many of you have given a whiteboard talk in the past, or a whiteboard talk or equivalent in the past 2 weeks? Keep them up. How many have given you a whiteboard talk in the past month? Okay, I don't even need to stop. I need to go on. Put your hands down. That's practically all of you. So every single one of you, at least 12 times a year, probably more, that's lying with statistics, is giving some kind of talk on one of these to get somebody to do something. Now, maybe it's get an idea into their heads. Maybe it's persuade them to do something, not coerce. Persuasion might be okay, coercion's bad. And how can you actually communicate what you want to communicate? We talk all the time. How often do we actually communicate? So, where do we begin? Well, first, my name is Matt Ringel. I am a network architect at Akamai Technologies, the world's largest non-network. I used to be, before I did this, I was in professional services at Akamai, where I was giving whiteboard talks roughly daily, probably several times a day. And so I learned a ton about how to give them because that was part of being part of professional services. But I also taught a lot of people on how to get their story out. So by the end of this talk, what I really want you to understand is how to structure a story that you're going to tell, narrow it down to something that is not going to lose or confuse your audience, adapt it on the fly to the audience you have in front of you, because you hardly ever get to select your audience, although you're all fine people, and how to control the conversation. Which sounds kind of evil, but what it really means is how to actually make sure that you get to tell the story that you need to tell while not running over your audience and making sure they get their needs met as well. Come in, come in. Come all the way to the front. We don't have a camera for the whiteboard yet, so you're going to have to look at it with your eyes. So the thing I love about whiteboarding is this interesting combination of storytelling, which I adore doing, and doing it in a visual medium. I get to draw on a board, I get to illustrate things, I get to describe my ideas in a way where you don't just have to picture it in your head, but you can actually see something on the board that tells you what I'm thinking while I'm looking at it. So let me make a couple of assertions. So, what is a whiteboard talk? Well, what does it allow you to do? It's real time. I'm up here, or you're up here, you're up there, or I'm out there, and we're trying to communicate something. I'm trying to get an idea into your head, but it's happening in real time. I can't walk off stage, run off to a book, read something, come back. I have to deal with what I have in my head at this moment or on this piece of paper. That's all I get. So, storytelling. Oh, that's great. We got a camera. So, storytelling. The way that humans get ideas encoded in their head is through stories. Raise your hands if you've ever heard the story of the 500-mile email. Okay, one of you. In short, it's a fun little story. If you Google for 500-mile email or Bing it or whatever you feel like doing, you'll find the story about how there was this mysterious mail server failure that was actually traced back to an aggressive timeout due to speed, and it was found through speed of light issues, which was actually very interesting. I know I read it. And what I found by the end of it was that, I've run mail servers long, long time ago. But even then, I learned a little bit more about how they work and how servers interact and how things work. And I learned stuff despite myself because it was in the shape of a story. because there was a beginning, a middle, and an end. There was causality. And because of that, I was able to run those thoughts together and build a model in my head of how it works. So, real-time visual storytelling. Real-time plus visual plus storytelling equals whiteboarding. And so what we're going to talk about for the next umpty minutes is what real-time visual storytelling looks like and how to do it in a way that's going to help you. So a couple of logistics things. I'm not going to hold questions till the end, because this has got to be more interactive. There's just not that many of you. And in addition, I want to make sure that you get your questions answered. So every couple of units, there are about 9 units in this thing, every couple of units, I'll pause for a few questions, then we'll continue. Other logistics, always cap your markers, because they dry out in about 2 minutes flat. You're allowed to gesticulate with them, as long as you keep writing with them. So the first place we're going to start is boundaries. Or put another way, what is the story you intend to tell? And how can you restrict what you're going to talk about so you don't lose an audience? So let's say this whiteboard is everything that you could ever talk about with people, that you like talking about with people. So the first thing you have to decide is the horizontal boundaries. What is the scope of your talk? Why don't you draw horizontal boundaries or vertical lines? So that's the scope of your talk. Maybe it's a new transmission protocol. Maybe it's best practices for optical debugging. Maybe it's a whole bunch of other things. But by putting horizontal boundaries on your talk, you now say, these are the things I'm going to talk about, and these are the only things I'm going to talk about. And that's going to be very important later when it comes to handling difficult audience members. And we'll get there in a second. So you got your horizontal boundaries. The next thing you have to do is vertical boundaries. So these represent your scope. But the vertical boundaries represent abstraction. How much deep detail are you going to get into when you actually talk about this thing? For example, I know that in interviews, I have used, okay, I type www.nanog.org into a web browser and I hit return, what happens next? So some people will start at layer 3, and they'll start talking about they'll start talking about, or layer 7, start talking about DNS immediately or what have you. Some people stay at HTTP, some people go further down. If they're being extra super clever, they'll start talking about ARP. And if they're being really, really wise, well, if they're being really, really annoying, what they'll start doing is they'll start talking about the voltage on the USB line. Or even before that, they'll talk about the buckling spring in the key. Or even before that, they'll talk about the flexion of the finger. It's about 80 grams of pressure, by the way, depending on the keyboard. It's a really clacky keyboard. So the point is, and I might have been one of those people a long time ago, the point of that exercise is that if I hear somebody say, well, first you flex your finger, I'm like, are you taking this seriously? I mean, cool that you went that far, but can we actually get to the domain that we're talking about within this interview? Similarly, by choosing that, and that's something where you have no vertical boundaries. For example, down here, all the way in the weeds is the person talking about flexing their finger. All the way up here is, well, I hit return and then I get a web page. There's a lot of hand wavy up here. There's a lot of meaningless detail down here. Now, maybe your talk is all the way down here. Maybe you are talking about finger flexion and clacky mechanical keyboards. Maybe your talk is all the way up here because this is a talk about the overall business within video on demand, and we don't really care about how a web page actually gets to that browser in the mechanics of it. But you have to choose. And you have to make that narrow enough that you're not going to lose somebody. Because people prepare themselves to hear a story within a certain bound. Break out low, you'll lose them. Break out high, you will lose them. And this is part of rehearsing. Always cap your markers. This is part of rehearsing. This is part of making sure you understand your story. And that's another thing when we get to questions in a second. So one of the other things about setting boundaries and setting out boundaries on the talk before you actually start it is that you can self-check yourself during the talk. While I'm talking to you right now, one thing that's running as a background process is, am I telling the story I intended to tell? And if you've rehearsed and you've chosen your level of abstraction, you're going to know. You will know, I promise you. You're saying, you know, I don't think I meant to talk about that. I think I went into the weeds. At which point, because this is real time, all you can do, and the only thing you can do, and the best thing you can do, is finish your thought, pause for a second, and say, let's get back to what I was talking about. And just bring him back. But if you do not with intent figure out what in the world you intend to talk about and the abstraction you intend to use, you will not know that when you're talking. And you're going to get a lot of people staring at their phones or their laptops because they've lost the plot of it. So that's not meant to shame you. I was just pointing out you're looking at your phones and laptops. So what we have here, so before I go on, any questions about this? Everybody kind of got this? To the mic. Just so few of you got time.
Yeah, sorry. Adam Mills from Riot Games. The question was, you spoke about how you reorient yourself. Will you be covering how to reorient, either helping other people in the group orient themselves back, like getting out of the weeds later on?
Yes, I will. And funny you should ask. That's the other thing about if you put together a talk right, the question will then follow into the next thing you wanted to talk about. It almost worked. We'll get there, I promise. So now we know what a whiteboard talk is. It's visual real-time storytelling. We know how we want to actually think about the story we want to tell. So now let's talk about how we want to structure it. Restructure needs a frame. Framing. There's been a lot of talk of framing, and especially in politics and what have you, of the general rules by which people think by, et cetera, et cetera. What I mean in this case is one of the ways that you make sure the audience doesn't get too far into the weeds in the first place, how they guide themselves, is by putting a frame in their heads such that they're focused on what you're talking about. Now, let me show you one of the most insidious little diagrams I have ever seen drawn on board. Somebody knows what's coming. Four-square diagram, right? You got your axis X, you got your axis Y, and you've got your groups things 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? That could be fruit, vegetable, red, orange, fruit to vegetable, red to orange. We come up with stuff, right? Now, what have I done? I've drawn this little doohickey on the board. If you accept that, and you're not trying to do anything else, you've bought into about 4 or 5 different things. Number 1, there are 2 axes that we care about, and only 2. Number 2, we only care about the extreme points of those 2 axes, or a single attribute. We only care about 2 attributes on each of those axes. Number 3, there are only 4 actual objects we care about. Number 4, each of those objects is distinct from each other. Now, where that gets really nasty, because that is actually useful. That is really useful in a bunch of ways, but where it gets really nasty, how many of you have bought a car in the past year? Nobody? 2 years, 3 years, 3 years. Okay, that's about average for the US. So they worked you on the squares. They probably brought out a worksheet that had 4 squares on it, and it was interest rate, price, term of loan, and trade-in. Now, what did I just tell you? By drawing it like this, I've told you all 4 squares are distinct, which on a 4-square worksheet, you didn't think those about car buying, right? On a 4-square worksheet, they are actually all interrelated. So in your brain, you're saying, I negotiate on each of them differently because they're all different, because you have been presented a visual representation. But the car dealer knows that they're not. And so they're able to work you between them. So this is a tool that can be used for good or evil. I've shown you evil. But the good part is that it's a very, very quick way to make sure that you get the information that you are able to say, hey, there's 2 main variables here. There's only really 2 extremes that we care about, and there's 4 things I want you to take a look at because these are the combination of these 2 things. And a lot of things in the world kind of work that way. And so that's a very, very quick shorthand for doing that. Similarly, if I draw a line on the board, there's a single axis, there's 2 extremes I care about, maybe there's a midpoint, but now I've given you a single axis and 3 points we care about, and we only care about them, and it is a continuous realm. That whether it is or not, you now believe that there is actually anything is possible between those points. Once again, similarly, exponential curve. That's 2 or 3 lines on the board, 2 or 3 lines on the board depending on the way you count. But everyone in this group probably knows that's an exponential curve. We know how exponential curves behave. It kind of looks like my traffic graphs over time. There you go. And so that's a very, very easy way to get a lot of information and get people settled into their frame so they know that, okay, this is a story about exponential growth. We know a ton of things about exponential growth. Or this is a continuum. We know a ton of things about how continuums work and deal with them all our lives. And so this is exceedingly important because you need to work very quickly to get that frame set up so they're not wandering over to other things and saying, no, it's not. So a quick note about color. 2 markers, alike in dignity, black and red. If I'm having a financial discussion, this is positive, this is negative. If I'm having a discussion about electricity, all right? Color matters, context of color matters. Also, uncapping and recapping markers takes time, so don't use too many colors or you'll confuse things. The point is, make sure that you know who your audience is when you talk about things. I actually got tripped up the first time I gave this talk because I used a financial metaphor and someone in the crowd was an electrical engineer. Actually, probably half the crowd was electrical engineers and they were all laughing at me. But this matters. This also means that the expressions you use matter, because color is not only culture specific, but it is domain specific. Know who you're talking to before you use metaphors involving color, not because of hot button political reasons, but just because they're not going to know what you're talking about. And always cap your markers. So, did that answer a small bit of your question? Okay, we're going to answer more of it later. That's not good. Okay. So we've talked about quick ways to frame that idea in there. Oh yeah, one last thing I wanted to talk about in that regard, about framing. So we can make assertions about framing, about storytelling, in terms of enterprises are moving to the cloud. I assert this. If you're not going to say, no, they're not, because that's clearly not true either. Although you may have a debate about how enterprises are moving to the cloud or what the cloud is or what an enterprise is or what have you. In the end, you have proposed the problem. And so now you get to propose the solution. And that's great, because now you've proposed both of them and you can work a story between the two of them. One of the most, in terms of guiding a user, one of the most insidious types of framing out there is embodied in 4 words. The ad person who came up with that got a big, fat bonus. And here's why. Less filling tastes great. What have I given you a choice between? I haven't given you a choice between different brands of beer. I've given you a choice between how you enjoy a single beer. And we've already decided that, because that's what the ad's about, and I've already informed you what beer we're talking about. So now you just have to decide how you're going to enjoy drinking it and why you enjoy drinking it. Clever bastard. So you get to set up your... The great thing about being at the front of a room is that the only reason I'm an expert on whiteboarding is because I'm the one with the mic and standing in front of the room with this whiteboard behind me. Not for any other reason. So I have to prove to you that I know what in the world I'm talking about, which hopefully I am so far, and that remains yet to be decided. But what it also means is that you are the expert in the room until proved otherwise. That means people will give you the benefit of the doubt, and because they want to learn something from you, they want you to succeed. And so they'll kind of go along with you because you probably know what you're talking about. Use that to your advantage. You're proposing, but be sure of what you know. So in terms of the model, first thing, you have to know 10 feet deep to teach 3 feet deep. Because the way that you know what you're talking about is probably not the best way to teach it. Raise your hand if you have a computer science degree or have done computer science type stuff. A third of you, that's fine. So there's this problem called the knight's tour. Basically, you have a chessboard and you have a knight, and how do you get that knight to visit every single square? Note that I've actually assumed that you know chess. It's a safe bet, but you can't always know depending on the audience. How do you actually organize it so that the knight gets to every single square on the board in the minimum amount of moves? Okay, fine. It's a nice little computer science problem. Most freshmen, when they attack that problem, think of a chessboard. Okay, I'm going to move a knight, I'm going to set up an array of 8 by 8, and I'm going to move the knight around the chessboard and figure out things. Problem is, that's not actually a reasonable way to... That's a really inefficient way to figure out how to move a knight around a chessboard. You actually want other data structures. I'm not going to go into that now. That's not this course. But the point is, the way that you know what you know is not the way that you teach what you know. And that gets back to stories. How do you tell a story about what you know? What is the model you put in your head for how you talk about things? One really good way to talk about it is metaphor. You get to choose the metaphor because you're the one doing it. So choose some other way. How many metaphors do you have to describe a TCP three-way handshake? Don't answer that right now, just think about that. How many, put it another way, how many ways and how tersely can you explain it? One exercise that I went through when I was in professional services, and I recommend it to anybody who's trying to explain a topic to anybody about anything. Explain, summarize this topic to me in 2 minutes. 1 minute. 30 seconds. Single sentence. Can you do that? Can you actually boil it down to what you're talking, boil it down to the essence of it to explain something? Try explaining to a technical colleague, a non-technical colleague. If If you're able to do it in under 1 minute or under 30 seconds, you've probably boiled out most of the irrelevant detail that doesn't actually matter for the core of the topic and what makes it different from anything else they know. So I invite you to, after this, or maybe during this if you feel like it and you're not listening to me, take a topic and figure out, could I do this in 30 seconds? What would it look like? So, sorry for a second. In terms of metaphors, I once had a friend explain the chemistry of the hydrocarbon industry, including polymerization and cracking, with pool noodles in a pool. They basically got the pool noodles out and said, okay, this is what a typical hydrocarbon looks like. Here's what you're going to crack it. Here's how it looks. Here's what we do. And because I was able to actually see this gigantic chemical diagram arranged in pool noodles in a pool, I was able to get a good idea for how it was put up on the board. Similarly, if you're on a whiteboard, you can draw things out. And your chemistry teacher drew things out on the board, and it kind of worked that way too. So before I go on, the one other question for you is, well, the one other thing I'd point out is when you learn when you want to teach a topic, think back to how you learned it. If it didn't come naturally to you, if it did come naturally to you, you're actually kind of screwed, because then you have to figure out how normal people learn it. But if you had to learn it and you came by it hard and you really had to try, think back to how you learned it. Think back to the mistakes you made. Think back to the order in which you learned things and the way that your body figured things out. Because that's going to be a really good way to start explaining how this thing works and why it works this way. If I was to explain how to do a 3-ball cascade to somebody, I was drawing on a board, it would involve, well, first still 1 ball from hand to hand, and then 2 balls staggering, and then work from there into a 3-ball cascade. And I'd be able to draw that out on a board because I know that's how I learned it. And I had a whole bunch of standing in front of a door and tossing the balls against it and having them fly off in the middle of nowhere to prove it. So, think about how you learn. Now, before I go on, any questions before I go on? No? Pressing onward. You typically tell a story using words. You're going to use pictures and words up here. But, one second. So you're going to tell a story using words, which means you have vocabulary, which means you choose your vocabulary. So in this particular case, one of the traps that a lot of people, and all of you have heard it, if you've given a talk up at the front of the room, and someone said, oh, so that's like X, but like with Y change. You know, they found this thing, they said, oh, it's just like that, except for this little modification over here. I get it. So the problem with that is they've stopped listening to you at that point. They are satisfied that whatever you're going to spend the next 30 minutes of your life talking to them about is not important anymore because they figured it out already. Now, there are very, very rare cases where that might be true, where what you're talking about is not actually all that original or new, and you have to allow yourself that. But in general, that's not true. And so you have to be very, very careful about the vocabulary you use so that it doesn't intersect with what people are talking about already. If you say, here's a new way of looking at it, and then I use a metaphor, you know, if I'm talking about quick, or talking about quick in the other room, okay, instead of the conventional handshake, here's what we're doing instead. We're doing something completely new. Let me explain to you how that works. Now, I've gotten you away from TCP, the standard TCP 3-way handshake or your SSL 6-way, and now we're talking about this other thing over here. And this person doesn't get to use any of that anymore because I've already told them that's irrelevant. And so now I get to use my own words and my own terms and my own story to explain to the audience how these things work. Because what you want the audience to walk away with is this story of your thoughts. And not only a story of your thoughts, but a story of your thoughts and the words you choose to use, because then when they need to tell it to a friend of theirs or their team or their associates, they will use your words. Nearly verbatim a lot of the time. They will mix it with some of their own, that is the nature of human thought, but they will use your words and tell your story and able to propagate your story without you even knowing about it. And that is one of the ways that you're going to be able to talk about what's going on. So, just to sum up to this point, we've chosen the boundaries of what we're going to talk about. We have our abstraction or scope. We understand how we're going to frame the story and what are the thoughts around it, what is the problem, what is the solution, what's going to happen in the middle, and what do I provide as the solution. We have a couple of basic diagrams we can use to talk about things. You'll certainly find your own. You understand, metaphorically, you need to find as many ways possible to describe something. And you know to choose your terms. So, if you walk away from here with one lesson, if you walk away out of this room right now with one lesson, it's this one. That's it. If that is the only lesson that you come out with from this talk, hey, I attended Matt's Whiteboard 101 talk, another way I learned is that you don't make stuff up. I'm happy. Because you have learned more than most people who get in front of a whiteboard. And let me tell you how that happens, because those people aren't evil. Those people aren't dumb or misled or devious or horrible. But they're people who are not thinking about it. Now let me tell you how this works. I'm giving a whiteboard talk. I'm talking about something that I know really well, really, really well. And somebody asks me a question, and I am 100% certain of that answer. Well, clearly then I answer them, and I know I'm correct. But then there's a follow-on question. And they ask another question, and they say, well, hey, about that, can you tell me about this detail over here? Well, now I'm 95% sure. You know, maybe there's that thing, I didn't read that, it's a little bit obscure or whatever. But you know, I'm pretty sure I'm okay. So I answer that one too. And you know, I'll take 21 ounce. So, sure, we're set. Now I get another follow-on, because clearly now I'm the expert, right? I'm the expert at the front of the room. And they ask me another detail about that detail, which I probably read once about 2 years ago. And now I'm 75% sure. Well, the problem with humans is they like to be consistent. I answered you once, I answered you twice, I must be the expert on this, I'm feeling pretty good, I probably know more than, 2 sigmas of people out there. Sure, I'll answer your third question, that'll be great. But now I've only got a 75% chance of being right. But let's say I am. Let's say the odds are in my favor and I still get it right. Then I get asked that last question, where I'm maybe 35% correct. But now I'm being consistent because, hey, I knew that one, I'm just taking all comers, and I answer that fourth question because I wasn't thinking about it. Because, hey, I was right the first 3 times, I clearly must know this. And in the moment, remember, this is live. In this moment, you believe you're the expert, you believe your own press, and you answer that question. And you know what? Nothing happens. Because nobody actually knows if you're right or not, including yourself. So, they walk away. Let's say you get that last one wrong. It's a pretty good bet, too. So now you got that last one wrong. At best, they catch you. And now you've lost credibility with them. But hey, they didn't blow something up. At worst, they didn't catch it, they work on that information, or they stake their reputation on that because clearly you were the expert in the room, and now they blew something up because of you. Well, that's a really crappy feeling. Don't make stuff up. Also, one last thing about that. Everybody wants to make people happy. They smile, they laugh, feel like you're doing a good job. Don't trick yourself into thinking that you know something just because you want to make somebody happy in the room. Because that'll happen. And it sucks when they blow something up. So, after that poignant interlude, a brief note about parking lots. If I say parking lot in the discussion, if I'm doing a talk and I talk about I'm going to put something in the parking lot, everybody know what I'm talking about? Kind of get a couple of nods. You have a corner of the board. Hey, I don't know that. Let me get back to you on that one. Well, sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes that's really important because you can't break the flow of the talk. It's something that's kind of out in left field anyway. And maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it just doesn't work for the rest of your talk. You really want to keep moving. So here's the problem. Parking lots have a cost. You know, when I was training people, I'd see new professional services people that would put everything and their brother in the parking lot. And then I'd count up what they put in the parking lot over a 45-minute talk. And there'd be 18 items there, which is kind of horrifying. But beyond that, I counted up and I said, okay, where are you going to build that next 36 hours of your time to? You say, what are you talking about? I said, well, every single one of those things in the parking lot costs you 2 hours of the company's time. 1, because you answer their question. 2, because you got to do the research to answer their question, because now you have all the time in the world, so now you can get it right. In addition, there's going to be follow-on questions, just like the ones I talked about before, about horrifying details that you never knew anything about, but now you have to research even further. And so on down the rabbit hole until it terminates at some point when their curiosity is satisfied. And that's 2 hours for one thing in the parking lot. So remember that parking lots are important, they are useful, but they are also exceedingly expensive. So make sure not to use them too often, all the more reason to narrow your talk down. Any questions before I continue? Come up to the front, come up to the front. Any questions? To the mic, please. I'm the one with the mic.
Can I rock the mic? What about limiting the parking lot? Say, you know, at the beginning of the discussion, hey, you got 3 things we can table for later. After that, I can start charging.
If you can find a polite way to say that, be my guest. You know, if you can find, you know, hey, I'm only going to take 3 things in the parking lot. I have never been able to do that without people looking at me funny. And I've tried. So it's a good idea to limit the parking lot, but we'll get to figure out how that means in a second, because we're about to talk about, I'm sorry it took too long to get here. That's not a marker, this is a marker. How do you control the conversation? Because it's me standing up here, but it's you listening, and if it's a bunch of people around a meeting table, they're going to ask questions because the assumption is that in a large group, in a small group, you can ask questions roughly whenever you want. So how do you control the conversation? First step, agenda. Now I have an agenda, it just happens to be on this piece of paper. Have an agenda, know your agenda, stick to your agenda. By having an agenda, you give people the, you know, it's effectively the table of contents for the story you're about to tell them. And, as a bonus point, by being able to write out that agenda, they know how that story is going to flow. You're already setting up that thought model inside their head by having that agenda on the board that they quickly read. I typically put it on the board and I leave it on the board. It helps sometimes. Don't always have to do that. but it means that that someone can look over there and say, hey, they're going to talk about this next. Okay, fine. Now, sometimes that means they check out until they get there, but it's not like you announce everything you talk about. So the great thing about agendas is that you can blame them. Hey, you know, that's a great question, but we got a lot to cover there. Let me talk to you later. There's a lot to cover today. Can't really spend much time on that right now. We don't have much time in this meeting. Everyone else, are you in the room, including your boss, agree? Okay, that's great. Let's talk later. And sometimes they do. Most of the time they don't. Why? Because they didn't actually care about the question they were asking. Most people don't. I mean, sometimes people really want to know, and we'll get to the types of annoying question people later. But if they really have an honest question, if it was relevant in that moment, then it will be even more relevant when they get to think about it more 35 minutes from now, when they either get to pop open mail buffer and write something, or they actually get to talk with you. So, talk about agendas, how you structure them. Think of it as a table of contents. Think of that as a way that you can actually structure your story when you're working out and rehearsing it. I did mention rehearsal. Rehearse, very important. So, also, invocation. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming today. We got a lot to cover and I'm really looking forward to you. My name is Matt Ringel. This is Whiteboarding 101. Here we go. That's an invocation. I have told you we are now beginning. I have told you what we will now begin. That was the end of the talk. My name is Matthew Ringel. Thank you for coming. This is Whiteboarding 101. If you have any questions, please reach me at ringel@akamai.com. That is my real email address. And feel free to find me elsewhere on Twitter at @Ringel, blah, blah, blah. That's an invocation too. I'm telling you, we're done now. There's a beginning. Now you're listening to me. Your agents, they're listening to me. It's called agentic state. You can actually look that up. It's kind of cool. Teachers use it all the time. Or, or at the end say, okay, we're done now. And now you can tie that all up in your head with a bow, or if you have any follow-on questions, you can now kind of freeze them in paper and work from there. Humans really dig that stuff because it sets up the state in their head and they know when to turn it off. Ask any spiritual leader, this stuff works. So, in terms of other things, deferring. Hey Matt, what about frobbing the Framistan? I've been trying to frob the Framistan with like a 1/2-inch frobber. Can you help me with that? I don't know how to frob a Framistan with a 1/2-inch frobber. I don't. It's a great question though. I'd love to get back to you on that, but I really can't answer that right now. I just don't even know where to start. You're still the expert on the story that you intended to tell, even if you say, I don't know, to something very specific. So be okay with saying, I don't know, which gets back to consistency and talking about don't make stuff up. Because if you hit a point, because the way that you break that chain of 100%, 95%, and so on, is to just say, you know, I was with you up until right there. That's getting really, really into details I haven't taken a look at in a while. Let me get back to you on that. If that's really important to you, send me a mail with your specific question, and I promise I will get back to you. And that's the way you break that chain of making stuff up. Yes, to the mic, please.
Hi, I'm Rodrigo with Riot Games. You touched there on a point that could be helpful on managing the parking lot. Could you ask people to look themselves up the details they're asking for? So if you remember part of it, you know where to find that specific information. If you go and look here and here, then you'll find what you're looking for.
I think the question is like, well, okay, how does this tie into a parking lot in terms of basically saying, I don't know, and then I can put it up there, and then having other people put stuff up there as well. Let's talk about that later. That gets into a little bit of, and the reason is that that gets into inviting other people up, which is a really tricky situation when you're actually trying to get your story out, because then they take time as well. So I can talk with you about that later, but not right now. I didn't mean to use you as an object lesson. I promise. But that's kind of what happened. So, do you have a question?
I do.
Okay.
Or more of a statement.
No statements, only questions.
Thinking of how I rephrase it. Then, is it okay to, instead of saying, I'm going to put this in the parking lot, say it's something I've never researched, I really have found no interest in myself, feel free to go look at it yourself.
So, I'll take that. That's fair. I've never told an audience member to go screw, and I'm certainly not telling you to do that. But this is a very, very subtle thing. In all honesty, it's a very, very subtle detail to be able to tell someone very quickly, not only don't I care about your question, don't know anything about it, but I really have no desire to spend any amount of my life on this earth answering it either. So, if you, sir, can find a polite way to tell that to people and not break the flow of your discussion and not have them want to knife you at the end, then more power to you. Typically, what I will do is acknowledge it and find out if it's germane to the topic at all. I'll talk to them afterwards and say, hey, is there a specific detail you're looking for? Because occasionally people ask very specific questions in very vague ways. So, any other questions before we go on? That's a good question. Almost, not quite. So let me finish that and then get a question. So, because I may not have answered your full question, I want to know. So the other thing is, bring them back. Figured. So in this particular case, that can mean a few things. You've got 8 people in a room. There's probably going to be a side conversation. Just because there's a meeting doesn't mean that work stops. Hey, somebody just got mail. Oh my God, my project's on fire. Oh my God, somebody just put out my project that was on fire. Oh my God, my project just got axed, which was on fire. Projects, fire, stuff. So the question is, if there's a small side convo, it'll probably peter out very quickly, especially if they're trying to be quiet. They're like, hey, there's something I really have to tell you. It's fine. Just keep going. As soon as it goes on for more than 30 seconds, stop. Ask them, hey guys, can you hold it till the end of the talk? Or, and especially if there's more than one side conversation, and saying, and it depends. You can be firm without being rude. It's one thing to say, I'll wait till y'all are done. Sorry, all y'all are done. I'll wait till all y'all are done. I'm from New York, so I kind of get that one messed up. And that's kind of rude. It's another thing to say, look, this is really important. Can you keep it? I mean, if it's really important, can you go out of the room and take care of it? Because I understand work doesn't stop, but this is a really important topic and I really need you all to understand it. Now you've told them, get out of the room. But you've told them why. Because this thing in here that you're spending 30 minutes of your life doing, or 90 minutes in this case, for which I thank you, because I find this stuff very important. I hope you find it good too. This is just as important because I need to get information to you. And if it's not important with whatever you're dealing with, well then, hey, you're an adult, go figure it out. Deal with the stuff you got to deal with, but don't interfere with what I have to do with the other 7 people in this room. Firm, not rude. Yes?
Any specific recommendations if that person who's having the side conversation is the CEO, CTO, CFO, etc.?
So if that person writes your paycheck, that's a special case. So I didn't mean to do the course in executive communication. That's Whiteboard 102. But in that particular case, you don't have 30 minutes of their time to begin with. So you kind of get around it. In a lot of cases, if they're having a side conversation, typically they're your sole audience. If it's C-suite, they're actually, there might be other people in the room, but they're the only one who matter, because they're the ones who are going to have to make a decision based on what's there. Obviously, for really tiny companies, it gets weird, but we're talking slightly larger. So it might be, so flip it around. It's not you saying, my talk is really important. Can you leave until you figure it out? Because they just had something that caught on fire that was much bigger than you. So maybe it's you get to interrupt them for 5 seconds. We're all adults here and say, hey Bob, hey Bob, do you want me to, is this an okay, I realize you're dealing with something, is this an okay time? I'll come back later. And so you get to defer. In some cases, if it's just a side convo and it peters out, who cares? But in other cases, you have to bow to the reality of, if you need this person to make a decision and you need their attention and you don't have their attention, you're going to have to wait until you get their attention. Now, sometimes that might be a depending upon how well you know them. Sometimes it might be something really important and you just have to reschedule. And that is one of the grim realities of the job.
Would you say it's too harsh to line out those rules during the invocation, for example?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Sometimes, is it too harsh to, outline those rules, outline some ground rules during when you say, hey, we're here, we're going to do this thing, here's some ground rules on how we're going to handle this, because there's a lot of information to go through. It really depends upon how structured the rest of everything is. It's hey, this is a full day event, everybody gets half-an-hour slots, nothing can go over, because you've got to think of what is calling for those rules to happen. If I say, okay, it's a 30-minute slot, there's a lot to cover, I'm going to go for 25 minutes, and there's going to be 5 minutes Q&A, and then we are done, and I'm very sorry I have to cut you off, but the next people have to get into this room, that's okay. But you have to have a reason to do it. It can't just mean pay attention to me, because people should be doing that anyway. That make sense? Okay. So paired with bring them back is let them in. These are not mannequins you're talking to in the audience. I can prove it. I've heard you guys talk. So how are you going to, how are you going to involve the audience when you're talking? Sometimes it's pausing for questions every now and then. You've noticed every unit, I pause for questions, you come up, I answer them, we move on. One of the things that's very important, and I've been doing it with everybody who's asked a question, just so you know, listen to all the words of the question. Especially in a technical realm, you're going to hear the first 5 words of the question, and then all the knowledge is going to slot into your brain, and you're going to say, hey, they're talking about Frobben-Framistans again. I love Framistans. And you know all about Framistan Frobben, and that's cool. And so you don't even listen for the last of their question, because it's probabilistically true, out to about 95%, that the question that they're going to ask is about how you twist a Framistan clockwise after frobbing it. And that's fine, because there are a lot of clockwise frobbers Framistans. But let's say that's not the question they were asking. Let's say they're asking something completely different. And so by the time you're done, you glibly answer their question. It probably has some bearing on what they've asked, because you do have some knowledge on the matter. You've probably answered your question thoroughly, but you haven't answered theirs. And so they'll sit down because they feel like they just got schooled by an expert on the subject, but you won't have answered their question. And so they'll sit down confused and a little bit disappointed and wondering whether they should have asked it at all. And now you've got somebody who thinks less of you, doesn't know the subject as well, and now might not look at that topic at all more, and now they're less effective at their job. I know that's a lot of weight to carry. But it happens. So listen to the entire question. It feels good to be right. It really does. It feels good to know you have the answer within seconds of them opening their mouths. But you will not, you will miss the opportunity to learn something yourself about what people ask about if you don't actually listen to the whole question. Also, mechanically, choose 3 proxies in the room. There are 3 of you I've been looking at in this room on a pretty regular basis. I'm not going to tell you who you are. I switched it up. But I've been looking at each of you, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, and so on and so forth, to gauge the room. So I look at someone. If that person is smiling over here, that whole side is smiling. If a person in the middle is bored, they're all bored. If the person there is looking at their phone, they're all looking at their phone or their laptop. And so you have to, and that's a way of gauging the room. You can't look at everybody, okay? Even with the 37 of you in this room, 42, sorry. I can't look at everybody. If you count, I'm probably wrong. So I can't look at everybody in this room, but I can look at 3 of you. And by looking at 3 of you, everybody in the room thinks I'm looking at them. And that connection is exceedingly important. So choose 3 proxies in a room. It reduces your cognitive load, so you just have your eyes just keep fall there, and just keep note, happy, bored, annoyed, fidgety, and so on. And that's going to help you a lot with gauging the audience very quickly and adapting your talk necessary. Maybe you have to pick up the energy of the talk. Maybe you have to slow it down a little bit. Maybe they're looking for something a little bit more serious, and so on. One thing I've been doing with you guys, checking in. Okay, any questions? Any questions? All right. For longer talks, yes? The question is, how often should you check in? Next time, come to the mic, but it's cool. How often should you check in? It varies. I'd say for a shorter talk, like 30-minute talk, divide it in 2, check the midpoint, and then you'll have Q&A at the end anyway. If you hit a large amount of information, if you've just like done a couple of units, a couple of chapters in your story, then check in and say, okay, now we've done this, now we've covered chapters 2 and 3, which are blah and blah. Do you have any question? Summarize, ask for questions. Okay, when we've covered framing and modeling, ask for questions. Mike, please. This is not for my benefit. I can hear you, but they can't.
When you're gauging a room and you see someone or part of that room, you take it as they're bored or not interested. What does that mean to you that you're going to pick it up?
Well, that's a good question. So what it typically means they're bored, not interested, I'm not engaging with them. Either what I'm talking about is not engaging, or I'm not engaging with the audience. I'm not talking with you directly. So maybe I'll come off the podium. Maybe I'll look at more of you. Maybe I will think in my head very quickly about what I'm talking about. Really, am I rambling a bit? Yeah, I probably am. Okay, let's just move on. Let's keep the energy up. Let's keep the topics up. Let's give you a little bit more novelty so that you stay engaged. Or maybe I have to get more serious. Maybe, you're hearing blah, 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 whiteboard, blah, 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 blah. Don't make stuff up. Dramatic pause. What does that mean? So in the case of an audience not engaged, a lot of it is give some direct engagement the best way humans know how. Give more eye contact. Look at them. talk with them, maybe pick up the pace a little bit so they're getting a little bit more novelty in their heads. So they're getting the dopamine hit, so they're saying, hey, there's something new here, I should look at it. There's another mammoth on the plane. So that kind of thing. That will actually help with, in real time, you can't change the topic of your talk. If your topic is boring as toast, either get better at talking about it or get a better topic. But if you can't change that, then understand that maybe you should be picking up the pace of the talk to talk about more new things, to get more ideas into their head quickly, because they're not chewing on them as fast. Good, because maybe they're saying, okay, I got that, move on. So a couple of other logistics in terms of breaks. If you're giving a talk that lasts a couple of hours, a large tutorial, give a break every hour between meal times for 5 minutes. Work doesn't stop. People want to check their mail. People want to check their phones. People want to do stuff with Facebook or choose your social media and what have you, G+, go G+, and stuff like that. So with that being said, because I've left the fun stuff for last. Standard geek pitfalls. I'm a geek. Sorry. I'm a geek. A bunch of you in the room are geeks. That's cool. We're friends. There's a lot of things that we all do. I feel confident in saying we all do, because I've seen a lot of you do it. Not you personally. I like you. About how we process information, and about how we talk about information, and how we try to convey it to other people. And what works in a couple of group of friends where you're all kind of in the same field and you all kind of know, and you're actually communicating social energy as well, and you're communicating social bonds, doesn't work when you're talking to an audience who you do not know, give or take. So, for example, I call it knowledging. Hey, how you doing? Yeah, I talked all about Frommenframstan, so let me tell you about Frommenframstan. But first, before I talk to you about that, I got to talk about this other thing. And there's this other thing I did over here, which totally relates to Frommenframstan. And so you basically dump an unstructured mind map of your head on top of this person about Frommenframstans. And the problem with that is that, once again, the way you know it is not necessarily going to be the way you teach it. You have had time to assimilate that information. You've had time to fit it all together. You know how it all goes. And now you are just giving large amounts of unrelated information, and because you're a smart person who has a whole bunch of connections in their head, you start pulling in stuff from all over the place that's completely unrehearsed. You lost your audience within minute 2, and you're already at minute 8, and they have no idea what you're talking about, but they're nodding and smiling because you're a smiling and very engaging individual. That's a problem. I have seen professional services people, when they give their first whiteboard talks, manage to not even start talking about the thing they were instructed to talk about, because they spent 45 minutes going into some picayune detail somewhere because it was really awesome. Fun talk, but they failed. So, and also, one of the things that technically oriented people tend to do if they're not confident is they'll start just blathering information at you about the stuff they do know. So, hey, if I tell you all this stuff I do know, you won't notice that I don't know that thing over there that you actually asked me about. Look at pterodactyl. And Elvis. Elvis is right there. No, he's not. So, the thing is, we all know it when you see it. So don't do it. If you don't know the answer, just say you don't know the answer and don't try to put a smoke screen up, because your audience will know. Taking questions personally. Someone says, "You're wrong." When they say you're wrong, well, okay, they're being a little bit rude maybe, but when they say you're wrong, they're not saying you lied to them. They're not saying you misled them. They're not saying you're a horrible person. They're not saying you cheated at dodgeball when you were both 5. They're not saying any of that. They're saying, I believe you to be incorrect. Different cultures in the world have different ways of saying that. There are some cultures where you go, I'm not quite following you there. Can you walk that back a little bit and explain what's going on? Which might be the same as, you're wrong. Which might be the same as, you're an idiot. You have no idea what you're talking about. I don't want to hear another word from you unless you can correct yourself. And those all mean the exact same thing. But depending upon what culture you come from, you may take that very, very personally. I didn't lie to you. I didn't mislead you. What are you talking about? I'm not a horrible person. I totally didn't cheat at dodgeball. But yet that's the way it's going to feel, and it's going to throw off your entire game. It's just words that were said that were looking for an answer. And if you just interpret all of those as that person opened their mouth, words came out that all equated to, I don't understand what you're talking about, can you help me? You're going to be in a lot better shape when you get people of any number of cultures in a room and be able to keep your cool and answer that. Because otherwise you get very defensive, at which point it turns into a, oh yeah, well you're wrong too, and you're all wrong. And now you look like an idiot because you've just taken off the expert crown, put it down, rolled up your sleeves and said, I'm going to be an idiot like the rest of you. So don't do that. Getting bogged down. We're engineers for the most part, like details. Hey, there's that cool thing I was working on. Did you know that it actually load balances with like ports 1 and 3 as opposed to 1 and 2? And it's awesome. And yeah, I had that problem too, and it sucked, and blah, blah, blah. We all do it because the details are part of our jobs. We were hired because we have an eye for those details. We were hired, and we get compensated based on catching those details and understanding what it means and understanding that the small things genuinely matter. But in the case of a story, they really don't. Not a lot of the time. And if they do matter, you have to pick and choose it. Say, okay, these are the details that matter, these are the ones I'm going to talk about. One of the neat things about leaving out details, especially ones that don't matter, is that people will fill them in from their own knowledge. And people do not argue with the details they made up for themselves. And you can bet on that every single time. So, if you leave out extraneous detail, not detail that matters, I'm not telling you to lie, I'm not telling you to fabricate, but if you leave out extraneous details, you can count on everyone else in the room filling in the right ones, for the most part. And that's, once again, that's going to help you. So keep that in mind. Breaking the flow of details. So hey, there was this awesome thing that happened to me, and it was on Thursday, maybe it was Wednesday. No, it was totally Friday afternoon, after I dropped off that envelope. No, it was Wednesday. No, it was totally Thursday. Nobody cares. Not a single person in this room cares that you dropped off a sheet of paper at a place on Wednesday. They care about the story you were about to tell before you so rudely interrupted yourself. So, don't get bogged down in those details. Don't correct, run with it. If I had to choose a rule of thumb for, if the day of the week really doesn't matter, but you need to fill something in, so you fill it, say, it happened last Thursday. If that makes it better for you, just say, so last Thursday this thing happened. Or, a month ago on Thursday this thing happened. If you need to fill in something to make the pace go. But it's not relevant to the story. So, and it's not in response to a question. So, and the last thing, and this gets back to the levels of abstraction I was talking about, topic jumping. hey, we're talking about this thing, I'm talking about, and by the way, that reminds me of this time I was at this car dealership. I rehearsed the car dealership thing. That doesn't count. I was at this car dealership, and there's totally this awesome car, but yeah, and that's totally related. Just wait for it. Wait for it. People never wait for it. People never wait for you to, come back on this really cool other thing, unless you're like reading novel on Neil Stephenson. So just don't worry about it. But the point is, know the topic you're talking about. If you're going to make excursions off of them, rehearse them. This is a rehearsed talk. There's a little bit of improv in here. But I knew what I was going to cover, and I knew the excursions I was going to make when I talked about the Foursquare, and talking about other things as well. Not everything, you're not going to say everything word for word. That totally doesn't fit on here. But know what you're going to be talking about, and know when you're going to bring in other topics. Because bringing in other topics from other places can be very, very powerful. Because now you're going to catch a whole bunch of other people in the room who may have other knowledge, and now they attach your story to multiple places in their brain. And that's really powerful. But you can lose people just as quickly. So I'll actually, before I ask for questions, I'll tell you what the last topic is. So that's the last topic, and how to deal with them. Before I get there, do you have any questions?
In a lot of cases, when I'm doing whiteboard presentations, I'm expecting a result, an action, something. How do you guarantee that the people in the room come to that same conclusion or come to that same realization? I mean, shepherding or...
So, I'm from Boston. The alien mind control ray didn't fit in my luggage. You can't really guarantee that someone's going to come to the same place. It's an inexact science. One of the ways that you get there, is by telling stories. Because I can tell a story to you about something. And if you find enough places to attach it in my brain, number one, it's going to stick. Number two, you're going to be able to tell it to somebody else. So you're telling a story to 8 people in a room. And while you cannot guarantee that they're all going to walk away with what you said, you're not giving them a quiz at the end. But what you can do is at the end, for example, you may summarize. Say, okay, so here's what we've learned today. Note that you're asserting this is what they've learned today. I assert this. Do you have any questions? So now you've tied up your story with a little bow, and you get to ask them if they have any questions about it, and now they're asking questions about the story, and only about the story as you've laid it out. Less filling, tastes great. So you cannot guarantee that they're going to walk away with exactly what you wanted, but by telling a story about it and telling a coherent story about it, and making sure that you've actually narrowed down the abstraction to something that's going to stick in their head, you have a really good bet that they will. Did that answer your question? All right. So, there are 4 tests. Let's see. All right, 15 minutes, perfect. So, there are 4 fundamental types of problem children that I have found, specifically at conferences. You've probably seen most of them, if not all of them, this week, by the way, just so you know. The last time I gave this talk at NANOG Atlanta, back last February during the snowpocalypse, it was at the beginning of the conference, and people were actually calling these out as they happened during the conference. It was really awesome. And next time, armed with this knowledge, because this is kind of the last tutorial, armed with this knowledge at the next NANOG, which I think is Montreal, something like that, you'll get to play the NANOG Bad Audience Member Drinking game with me. So here we go. Bad actor number 1, the sniper. This is a person who wants all the power but none of the responsibility. They're the one who sits in the room and they're talking to their friend sitting right next to them and said, wow, this guy's a real idiot. You hear what he said about that? Oh, I'll say that's not what happened over there. Oh yeah, whatever. Now, the thing with stage whispers, because they're always done in stage whispers, is that you can hear them from the stage. So I can hear you if you're making the side comments to people or not, or I can look at you doing it or what have you, and you're kind of giggling, well, he has no idea what he's talking about. So the problem with that is it's very distracting, not just for me, but for everyone around you, or for everyone, you know, this person, so this person is, look at what this person is doing. Number one, they're getting attention of the person next to them at the expense of the person on the stage. Number two, they want the power to talk back to the person on the stage. They want to say, you're an idiot. But they don't actually have the fortitude to come up and say it and get up to the mic, and even just get up to the mic, which is what the mics are for, and say, I think you're wrong. So they instead can't do that, but they really want to say something, so they want to have it both ways by telling their friend and telling everybody around them. And sometimes a little bit more so because they do over IM or IRC or take your pick. And that's a problem. So what can you do? Well, here's the thing. They want all the power, none of the responsibility. They want to be able to be anonymous while they're making these remarks. Teachers, third grade teachers, who have known this for a long time. Tommy, do you have anything you'd like to share with the class? This is a third grade tactic being practiced by grown adults. And so you take the spotlight. All right. You have anything you'd like to say? And sometimes they get up to the mic, in which case, great, because they had a question and you've now emboldened them to ask it. Sometimes go, oh, no, didn't have anything. Either way, either you've emboldened them to ask a real question, or you've given them the attention they don't want, and so they shut up. Really, that's the only ways to deal with snipers. You give them the attention they don't want, and then move on. And that's a pretty foolproof way of dealing with it in general. Have I ever had it backfire? If it could be said so, the way I've had it backfire is I've said, shh, do you have anything you'd like to say to the class? And they get up to the mic and they say, I think you're an idiot, and I think you've been an idiot for this entire talk, and I don't think you know what you're talking about. I don't know why you're up here. And you pause for a second at that point, not because you're stunned. Not because you're stunned, because you kind of knew. But because now they've made themselves an idiot in front of the entire room. And they've just burned out. And now they've woke up to found themselves standing in a mic in front of a whole bunch of people who now think this person at the mic has 5 heads and 7 elbows. I didn't have to do a damn thing. It backfired on them. I've had people tell me get up to the mic and say, oh, okay, I'll get up, and tell me I'm wrong. And they said, it appears we have a difference of opinion. Let's talk about it later. And we talked about it later. It's like, I don't think you know what you're talking about here. This is the fundamental problem. And we reconciled it over time. But once there was actually 2 people talking together, and they didn't have an audience, they weren't going to blow up at me. And so you just take it down to that level. If a person has a real question they really want to ask you, they will come up afterwards because they'll still have it in their head. What you can also get to, and we'll get to this one, and actually we'll get to it now. I'm going to move things around a little bit. Number 2, the status seeker. This person doesn't actually have a question. They want to signal to the rest of the room that they're smart. They happen to be doing that by standing up at the mic and having words come out of their throat hole that happen to involve a question mark at the end. Sit with that image for a second. It would be as if they came up to the mic and said, hello, I'm such and such from blah blah networks, and I want to say that I'm really smart, and I want to make sure my boss, hi boss, I know the promotion cycle's coming up, so I want to ask a really smart question. What does the panel feel about that? That's what most of those boil down to. And so sometimes it's at a conference, it happens at a conference. Sometimes it's at, in a smaller room where, it's a vendor talk, for example, they say, and this person in the room is like, hey, I remember the time you guys really screwed up that thing in Model 5, like 2 years ago. What do you say about that? And then it's your turn to be the adult in the room and say, yeah, we know those things happen. It was kind of interesting. If you really want to talk to a sales engineer about it, we can get there. But the reality is that they didn't actually want an answer to that question. They just want to be looked on as smart by their peers. And if you, in a lot of ways, if you just say, that's a great question, I don't really have time for it right now, but if you want to talk about it at the end of the talk, just find me and we'll sit down and talk. And 99% of the time, if they were just seeking status, you'll never see them again. Just won't happen. They won't even remember the question they were asking because it wasn't about the question. It was about the act of asking a question. Number 3, the bully. This is a person who has had an immune response to whatever you have talked about. You have said something that is so anathema to their existence on this firmament that they cannot hear a single thing that you're talking about next. Like, I'm done. It's over. What the? You're just wrong. I want to tell you that you have no idea what you're talking about. I want to tell you that this is the way it is, and you just should get off the stage. Typically, that doesn't happen in conferences. That typically happens in smaller groups where that person believes they have status. In that case, what I recommend doing, do not escalate. Do not go toe-to-toe with them. You will not win this one. You will lose whatever moral high ground you had by standing on this podium right here. Isolate them. They're just one person. They're one person acting unprofessionally at the top of their lungs. And wait for them to burn themselves out. Because if they're really having an immune response to it, so everybody's heard the thing about, just stop and count to 10. Okay? Does anybody know why that works? So the short form, I know you know, the short form is that it takes about 12 seconds for the rest of your brain to pick up from the fight and flight response that you initially have. So counting to 10 slowly means that the rational part of your brain can pick up the football and figure out what the hell you were talking about. Hence, if someone actually had a fight or flight response to something you said, especially in a technical setting, so it's kind of illogical, wait for them to bury themselves, burn themselves out. You're going to notice about 12 seconds later, they're going to begin to lose steam because they kind of woke up and realized they're standing up and yelling at you. Isolate. Do not escalate. Because if you escalate, then that fight or flight response is just going to take over and it's going to end up in a cycle and you're going to be derailed. They're not going to get their question answered and now you've lost your expert status. And so the fourth and final one. I'm going to go back to my Klingon heritage for this one, called NANOG. How many of you know the author John Scalzi? A few of you. He actually came up with this term. It stands for not a question, more of a comment. For example, have you had someone walk up to the mic? I'm actually reading. This isn't a question, but blah, 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 and blah, 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 and also blah, 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 blah. Or alternately, would the panel agree with blah, 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 blah? Or I was wondering if blah, 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 blah. Or finally, anytime you get those kind of, well, I need to give some, or here's another one. I need to give some context to this question. 5 minutes of blah, 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 and then a question. So they've wasted the entire audience's time. And especially if they do that last one, where they're saying, I need to give here's some context for this question. They didn't actually want to be in your talk. They wanted to have their own talk, where they got to be their own panel, and then have you answer their question for them. Because any question that requires 5 minutes of context is probably not germane to the panel that they're in. And also, these are people, especially when you're doing this, not a question, more of a comment, it can happen honestly. It's not, once again, not evil. It's just the way people work. Hey, I've got a great question. It's like, hey, that raises a great question in my head. Except, so now you've got a person who's trying to listen to the rest of the talk while they're composing the question in their head. They have second thoughts about how they phrase the question, but sometimes they just short-circuit it, they get up to the mic, and then start emanating words from their throat hole that may have something to do with the question that they were asking, but they never organized the thought. And so now they're giving a comment instead of a question, because they didn't think hard enough about it. So please, for the love of all conference members everywhere, if you come up with a brilliant question during a panel talk, have a piece of paper, type it out on your phone, whatever you're going to do, write down the question. Number one, it might not actually be a question, odds are it's not. Or number two, you get a chance to actually phrase it in the form of a question that is actually a question worth answering as part of the talk, or you might table it. One rule that a friend gave me was, if I have a really important question I feel like I must say right now, I wait 10 seconds. If it's still relevant, I wait another 10 seconds. If it's still relevant, then I ask it. Just to make sure just to make sure that I'm not discarding the entire talk in the favor of I must get up to the mic and say something. In terms of the general knack-mock problem in general, just cut them off. There are times to be firm, there are times to be rude. In this particular case, it means, will the panel agree that? No, they won't. Sorry, Nick. Well, this isn't a question. It's not a question. Can we take it till afterwards? I have no patience for people who do that because they waste everybody's time. And so I'll be nice about it. But in general, I don't do anything with it. I will not handle it. So, this all being said, I hope you got something out of this talk. I hope that you're able to walk out of this room and be able to give a more effective presentation. If you have any questions, I'm here. I'll be glad to answer any questions you have after I de-mic myself and get that bottle of water into my system, because it's dry in here. And I hope that you'll be able to give a more effective talk and that you have methodology for doing this. I believe the slides that are the notes of this talk are up online. If they're not, I will make sure they are within the next day or so. I'm pretty sure they're recording it. And thank you all very much for being here and listening. Thank you. Any questions?
Actually, I do. So going back to
Can you speak up a little bit? I'm sorry. Sorry.
Going back to the bully, can you give me an example of how you dealt with the bully? So let's say the widget doesn't go clockwise, it goes counterclockwise. How dare you?
So if they're yelling at the top of their lungs, it depends. If they're really aggressive, they're trying to get in my face, because this happens. This really does happen. I'm typically just going to stand there and look at them going, what are you doing? Once again, it requires nerve. I'm not going to lie to you. But sometimes the only thing you can do is just stand there and go, are you okay? Because they're not in their right mind at that moment. And you should treat them as such. And wait for them to burn themselves out. If they actually have a real question in there, this is where you get to be the master of the mic. And if they ask a question, you can then say, here's the question that I heard. And they can either get up to the mic and say, you're wrong, that's not the question I asked. But if you're fair about it, by rephrasing the question, which is for the benefit of people who can't quite hear what's on those mics, but also so that everybody understands the question that I'm answering, you get to deflect all the emotional tone out of their question and actually answer the core of what they said. And I said, like, for example, in this case, like, so they were asserting, clockwise frame-stands are actually utterly different from counterclockwise frame-stands, and how can I actually be talking about one? And that's a fair point, because there's a couple of schools of thought. There's the clockwise school and the counterclockwise school. They both have merit to them. I decided to focus on the clockwise school because I perceive the following benefits out of it. I'll be glad to talk with you about that later. You acknowledge, because they're kind of seeking status too. It's you're telling me something that's wrong to the very fiber of my being. How can I stand here? I'm like, well, by me acknowledging that you're a human being who has a question, I'll talk with you later. Did I answer your question? Any other questions?
Another type of bully, and this happens more in office scenarios, in small scenarios, where they're constantly badgering you with more questions and trying to see if you fall and trip.
So there's a couple of tricks there. One thing you can do is, if they are not the highest status person in the room, you can start addressing the highest status person in the room. Because if this person is seeking status, by addressing the higher status person in the room, you're implicitly saying, can you get your guy under control? But you're also saying, I'm talking to the people who are actually engaged in this conversation. You're isolating them. By basically, because they can keep asking questions, most of the time they just burn out. And so just let them use their own energy. Don't feed any into them. Any other questions? All right, so you can find me, Ringel at Akamai. You can find me on Twitter at Ringel. You have any questions for me, I'm standing right here. And thank you all very much for coming. Thus endeth the talk. Glad you liked it.
Trying to capture that information for people. I do a lot of